Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Good afternoon. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to have this opportunity to address you today about a remarkable man, Sir Muhammad Zafrulla Khan, the first Foreign Minister of Pakistan, the first Asian President of the International Court of Justice, and a former President of the United Nations General Assembly. As we have just seen in that wonderful short film, Sir Zafrulla played an important role not only in the history of Pakistan, but also in the early period of decolonization that saw several nations in North Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia become independent nations. He was one of those statesmen who knew how to navigate the corridors of power at both the League of Nations and the United Nations. And perhaps his most well-known speech was that supporting the cause of the Palestinian people at the United Nations in 1947, which I shall return to at the end of my talk. He also gave powerful speeches in support of Iran's efforts to nationalize its oil industry. Due to his powerful speeches supporting anti-colonialism, at a time when the nations of the so-called Third World had forged an alliance with the Eastern Bloc nations, including the Soviet Union, Communist China, and other nations, to further self-determination, to advance self-determination in Africa and Asia, Sir Zafrulla became an object of suspicion by some Western international lawyers, which would come to haunt him during the Southwest Africa cases in the 1960s. This is a case that Ethiopia and Liberia brought before that institution when they sought to challenge South Africa's apartheid policy, its policy of minority rule and institutionalized racial discrimination. And they challenged that policy before the International Court of Justice when he was a judge there. And we have to remember that in the 1940s and in the 1950s, decolonization was still being actively resisted by the Western nations. They didn't think that decolonization was inevitable. They thought they could stem the tide, slow it down, perhaps even prevent it. We should also remember that Zafrulla was over 70 years of age when he was a judge in those cases. And he could have chosen to comfortably retire. He could have chosen the easy life. But instead he chose public office, and he was elected a judge for the second time in 1963, after having been elected as vice president in the 1950s. And it was following his experience in the Southwest Africa cases from 1960 until 1966, when he was forced, very controversially, to sit out of those cases by the then president of the court, the Australian judge Sir Percy Spender, that Zafrulla was elected as president. And he was elected president just prior to the court's 1971 Namibia opinion that's widely celebrated in international circles because of what it said about the rights of all peoples to self-determination. And he was elected in an election that directly pitted him against the formidable British judge, Sir Gerald Fitzmaurice. And Zafrulla won that election handsomely. There's a big backstory, which we'll discuss shortly, about his very difficult relationship with Fitzmaurice. But I think I can confidently say that had Fitzmaurice won that election in 1970, we would not have had the Namibia advisory opinion go the way it went. It certainly would not have made so much about the right of all peoples to self-determination. And that opinion is important in Namibia because it's the very first time self-determination is mentioned by the International Court of Justice. On the previous occasion, when it could have been referenced in the 1966 contentious judgment in the Southwest Africa cases, the judges, led by Percy Spender and Fitzmaurice, ensured that they didn't even address the merits of those cases. They didn't go anywhere near. They refused to address whether apartheid was contrary to international law. And so this is an important moment to also learn about the politics inside the International Court of Justice in the 1960s it also provides us with an insight into the moral integrity of Sir Zafrulla, who always stood up for what he believed was right, as we saw in that video, even if he had to stand against the whole world, even if he was the obstinate one saying no, 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 he was that person. Sir Zafrulla Khan belonged to those elder statesmen whose lives spanned 2 world wars. He was born in Sialkot in the Punjab, of what was then an undivided British India, when in February 1893, when William Gladstone was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and when Queen Victoria was the monarch. Britain was an important place in Zafrulla's life, for he studied law here, just down the road at King's College, London, just before the outbreak of the First World War. Sir Zafrulla died in 1985, when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister and when Queen Elizabeth II was the reigning monarch. When Zafrulla was born, the British Empire was at its zenith, and when he died, the British Empire had become a shadow of its former self. The world that Zafrulla was born into is almost unrecognizable today. The Ottoman Islamic Caliphate still existed, and he was almost in his 30s when it was abolished by Ataturk. And of course, the Ottoman Empire still existed. Tens of thousands of Muslim pilgrims would make the arduous voyage to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina on the caravan route and pass through Damascus and Jerusalem on the way there. This would all change following the First World War, when Palestine and its holy places were captured by the British Empire and partitioned. What was called the Middle East by Foreign Office officials became an imperial playground between the great powers that promptly carved it into spheres of influence pursuant to the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And the area known as Palestine had been envisaged in that agreement as an international condominium that was to be ruled by the Christian powers and the Emir of Hijaz, before a new British government was formed in December 1916, headed by David Lloyd George, that decided to promise the Jewish people a national home there instead. And this is the famous Balfour Declaration. For many nationalists, particularly those from the Indian subcontinent, the abolition of the Caliphate by Ataturk and the loss of Palestine's Muslim holy shrines, principally Al-Haram al-Sharif, was regarded as a great loss. Palestine became an anti-colonial cause as well as a religious one. In the 1930s, delegates from the All India Muslim League were horrified by Britain's repression of the Arab revolt in Palestine, when Britain institutionalized violence by promulgating emergency powers that included the death penalty, collective punishment, house demolitions, and administrative detention enforced through military courts with no appeals. In 36 months, some 528,000 Palestinian Arabs, 39% of the entire population, passed through detention, mostly without trial. I'm actually part of the group of lawyers that is seeking an apology from the British government and reparations for what happened during the revolt. What's interesting to know about this period is that delegates from the All India Muslim League, including Muhammad Ali Jinnah, put pressure on the British government to end its support for Zionism and to stop the killings of Palestinians by threatening to prevent the use by the British Army of Indian Muslim troops in the emerging World War. And the pressure worked. In the 1939 White Paper, the United Kingdom abandoned its support for the Balfour Declaration and said that Palestine should emerge as a single unitary state where neither Jew nor Arab would dominate the other. This, of course, all changed in the 1940s, after the Second World War, when the Western states supported the partition of Palestine and the creation of a Jewish state as a refuge for the survivors of the European Holocaust. The emerging leaders of independent India and Pakistan were horrified by the prospect of partition, having undergone their own experience of it in the Punjab and Bengal. Both independent India and Pakistan took up the Palestinian cause at the United Nations in 1947, arguing against the proposal to partition Palestine. They both voted against that resolution. They argued that Palestine should not bear the brunt of proposals to find a homeland for the survivors of the Holocaust, when this was a shared burden and a responsibility of all members of the United Nations. During the debate on partition at the United Nations, Sir Zafrulla, as Pakistan's foreign minister, made a particularly powerful speech, perhaps one of his most powerful that he ever delivered. He criticized the Western states for encouraging the survivors of the Holocaust to go to Palestine, where there was a war raging, all the while maintaining tight immigration quotas into their own countries. He then turned to the details of the UN partition plan, pointing out that the Palestinian Arabs remain the majority of the population in all its sub-districts, except for the Jaffa sub-district, as well as the majority landowners in all of the districts, including the Jaffa sub-district. He said it would be unjust to grant sovereign rights over their lives to an external group who would come to dominate them. For the United Nations partition plan was to be imposed on the Palestinians. Whenever you see the word partition, it's not a boundary that's freely reached. It's one that somebody else has imposed on a community or a group of communities. Jerusalem and Bethlehem were to become international zones under the direct control of the United Nations, and most of the fertile land, the most fertile land, was to be given to the Jewish state. Palestine would become a patchwork of disconnected parts. The only outlet to the sea would be through the port of Jaffa, that was an enclave surrounded by the Jewish state. In his speech, Sir Zafrulla criticized the idea that the United Nations could own Palestine and administer its holy places without paying attention to the interests and aspirations of the people who live there. He posed the following questions to the Western statesmen who still dominated the United Nations in those days. How is Palestine to be independent, he asked. What sort of independence? What is the solution that we are invited to endorse and attempt to carry through? In effect, the proposal before the United Nations General Assembly says that we, the United Nations, shall decide, not the people of Palestine, with no provision for self-determination, no provision for the consent of the governed. What type of independence would Palestine have? We shall call Palestine independent and sovereign, but Palestine shall belong to us, and it shall become the apple of discord between the East and the West. And then Zafrulla went on to say something profound that has haunted me ever since I first read it. He said, and I'm going to quote him at length, "We shall first cut the body of Palestine into 3 parts, of a Jewish state and 3 parts of an Arab state. We shall then have the Jaffa enclave, and Palestine's heart, Jerusalem, shall forever be an international city. This is the beginning of the shape Palestine shall have. Having cut Palestine up in that manner, we shall then put its bleeding body upon a cross forever. This is not going to be temporary. This is permanent. Palestine shall never belong to its people. It shall always be stretched upon the cross." If you think Sir Zafrulla was being melodramatic when he made this prophetic forecast, think again. Just look at Gaza. Look at President Donald J. Trump's Board of Peace. Are there any Palestinians on it? Have the Palestinian people and their political representatives ever had a real say in the future governance of their own homeland? Or must they always be at the mercy and machinations of the great powers? How can peace ever be achieved if it is to be imposed on the Palestinian people? Is the Palestinian state that the British government recognized recently independent And what is the purpose of international law if it cannot provide a modicum of safety and security for those Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere in Palestine who have known nothing but war, misery, and occupation for over a century now? These are the kinds of questions I imagine Sir Zafrulla would be asking were he to be alive and present today. And these are the questions that we earnestly need to be asking. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.